Hello. We have some new faces to the Witham E-Suites interviews this episode. I am Bria Boylan, tax supervisor at Witham on the state and local tax team. I specialize in sales and use tax with technology and emerging growth companies. Courtney Easterday is also here, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Rhea. So, Courtney Easterday, I am a senior tax manager here at Witham, lead up sales and use tax for Witham, and have a high focus also in the emerging growth and tech space.
Yeah, we are here with Steve Chapman, VP of Accounting at BirdBuddy. Steve has a plethora of experience in finance and accounting, roles with 7 years in the e-commerce space. BirdBuddy is an AI-powered bird feeder which captures photos and videos of local birds to receive instant alerts on your phone. And we're here to talk about sales tax and how the ever-evolving laws, starting with Wayfair, have affected e-commerce businesses. So Steve, with the evolving economic nexus rules, how do you ensure compliance across multiple states for sales tax?
Thanks for having me, Brett and Courtney. Pleasure to be here. Basically, I try to use the experts where I can. And I know I'm a CPA registered here in New York, but taxes are not my thing, especially sales tax. So I definitely want to go to the experts where needed. And that's where I've enjoyed working with both of you over the last number of years and last couple of companies I've worked for to help ensure compliance and deal with various nexus issues as companies I've worked for, especially BirdBuddy has expanded sales to the whole country and now starting to expand across the world.
So, has there been any strategies that you have implemented throughout your experience for sales and use tax and Nexus specifically?
I think the main strategy is to just keep an eye on where our sales are occurring on a monthly basis and to track, usually using third-party software where we're able to get notifications that we're approaching Nexus and then determine the next steps in terms of registering for sales tax at that particular state or other location, and then just basically staying on top of it. Sometimes for the various startups I worked for, where previous finance teams have registered ahead of time, way before Nexus has even been crossed. So we kind of have to catch up and adjust our kind of reporting and determine whether we actually still should be registered or if we need to actually go ahead and deregister from those various locations because we don't want to have to continue to fill out $0 returns and spend that time and money on sales tax reporting where it's not required at the time.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point because we've actually been seeing a lot of states pull back on some of those regulations, right? So Alaska was one of the states this year that released guidance about, if you didn't need to actually be reporting in some of the localities and how you can pull your registration out. There are other states where actually they no longer will let you kind of volunteer to even register if you haven't crossed over some of those economic nexus thresholds. So you're 100% correct. And the space has been changing pretty significantly over the last couple of years. So, with Wayfair and post Wayfair, everybody panicked. And now it kind of feels like everybody's kind of getting on board with a little bit more of a generalization on how to deal with it across a lot of these states.
Yeah, and to add to that, you also brought up a good point with just staying on top of it, right? We see e-commerce horror stories of companies all of a sudden realizing the Wayfair laws affected them, and now 7 years post Wayfair, having potential exposure in states that they didn't realize they had. So staying on top of it is super important on a state-by-state basis, right? Because the laws by state are different. Some states have an economic nexus threshold of 100,000, while others are 500, and others are 250. So being on top of it with especially these third-party softwares are super helpful in keeping up with that, but also as a business, keeping up with it yourself to make sure that what the software is saying is true.
And just taking care of VDAs and using the whole voluntary disclosure process has been a struggle, but also important for me to manage. And I think most states are quite reasonable in dealing with new startups and companies that are not sales tax experts, and they're willing to work with you. And as long as you kind of admit upfront that you're new to this, they are very forgiving in terms of past reporting and filing VDAs and working with both of you on filing those VDAs has been a good process to kind of start fresh and kind of not really worry about what was done in the past and just say, okay, we're going to take care of those issues, and going forward, we're going to be super clean with our sales tax reporting.
And there are benefits to the business too, right? So, obviously coming up front is a lot better than getting caught down the line, right? Especially if the
Right.
business is aware it's something that is supposed to be taken care of. And kind of the point of it too is really just to get you in a position of comfortability. Nobody likes to hear that their business is not in compliance. And the whole point of running a business is just to do things the way that you should be doing things, right? So the fact that those states even have those options that are available. And to your point, I know you mentioned that it was great working with us, but one of the things that Bria and I get to do is we actually work with a lot of state representatives, and we've actually over the years, really built those relationships with those state representatives, because a lot of them have been in place or at least been in a role within the voluntary disclosure units for some time. So it's been great to have that experience to work with each of those individuals and be able to kind of handle things on a little bit more of a case-by-case basis to get the best situation for you too. Some of the states you'll notice, like Washington, right off the bat on their website, they specifically say like everything is case by case, but it truly is, right? And then we can always try to push for the best benefit for your company when you have the ability to have the wherewithal and go forward and kind of admit to the state that we need to fix something, right? We need to do something about it. So, I think you've been pretty instrumental in that for some of the companies that you've worked with us and making sure that that gets done and utilizing where necessary the resources that are available. So, how has technology kind of played a role in your understanding and streamlining of your sales tax compliance process?
It's been a huge part, and it's really essential, and I wouldn't be able to be compliant without the technology behind it, and filing the monthly sales tax returns when we're having potentially thousands of sales in that month and trying to deal with any sort of spreadsheet and then calculation of the sales tax owed. It is really not possible by streamlining through our payment processor and then connecting to the third-party sales tax software that actually collects all the data and kind of packages it all nice and neat into individual state and local jurisdiction returns, and then actually will then pull the funds from our bank account to then remit to those various locations. Makes my life 1,000 times easier, and I don't have to worry about hiring a sales tax person in-house that all they do is compile and file all the monthly returns.
Yeah. And I think you have actually seen some of what that filing looks like on a manual basis. It can get out of control quite quickly with just the amount of rates that exist that are out there. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you've actually been through the process of having different types of automation services, right? Work in conjunction with some of the companies that you've worked with over the past couple of years. Do you have any horror stories that you want to tell us about that?
A couple of years ago, the company I was with, we actually added a whole new product and forgot to basically tag that product as taxable. So we were making continual sales of this new product and pushing the new product and not realizing until the following month that we should have been charging and collecting sales tax on those sales, and then we obviously couldn't go back to our customers and say, oops, you owe us additional money for sales tax. So that actually hurt my company's bottom line at the time. And then we quickly were able to resolve and say to our engineering folks that anytime we have a new product, we have to make sure that we flip the switch and make sure that if it is taxable, to start collecting tax as soon as possible on that, because we don't want to have this black hole of sales that we realize we're going to have a big expense of paying the sales tax ourselves.
Yeah, we've actually seen it go sometimes the other way too, right? Where there's a new product that's put into place and some of the softwares that are out there actually automatically default it to a taxable item or tangible personal property, which, generally based would be taxable across the board. And in some instances, they were actually over collecting, right? Where maybe they shouldn't have actually been collecting. So I think it goes to the testament that you stated, having that automation in place is crucial. But to Bria's point, having somebody who actually can understand that software and put the proper restraints and testing in place to make sure that it's working the way that you want it to work is absolutely crucial to making sure that sales tax remains compliant. I hear all the time, not so much clients, but like people in general that I talk to about like what I do for a living. We're always like, oh, sales tax, that's easy. You tax everything, right? But it can be so, various across the states and ambiguous in some states as to whether or not something is taxable. So it definitely is a little bit crazy. And you're in kind of a fun space where you are still e-commerce, right? You still are selling a product right now with BirdBuddy, right? But you have this additional kind of layer to it that is that platform, that availability of being able to kind of see these birds as they come over to your feeder, which is amazing. So there's that additional layer of complication that comes with, any kind of e-commerce company that kind of enters into an additional space with technology too.
Yeah, and with that, Steve, you've seen firsthand how technology and automation can be great, but there is the implementation and monitoring process, right? Because without, as you mentioned, without properly coding your tax, collections could be wrong, or without properly monitoring your tax, collections could break, and all of a sudden you find out that you weren't collecting sales tax or reporting sales tax for a period of time if you weren't monitoring it, and that can raise flags with states. All of a sudden you went from reporting, I don't know, $10,000 of sales tax monthly to a state to all of a sudden zero, and now the state is like, wait, what happened? And they could flag for an audit, and then it becomes a bigger mess than it could have been if there was monitorization throughout with the technology, and
Hmm.
understanding that with automation also comes a little bit of manpower there.
Right. Exactly.
Are there any other like mistakes, I call them horror stories, really, that like you've seen throughout your process with implementing technology?
Sales tax is usually not the first thing that founders are thinking about. So there's usually some sort of delay between the first sales and when sales tax software goes live and it's calculating and charging correctly. Just making sure that basically the whole company is kind of on board with the fact that we need to be compliant with sales tax and unfortunately pass it on to the customers to pay, and kind of explain that and kind of swallow that medicine as not painful as possible.
It's always tough too, because I know I work in the space, so it's a little bit different for me, but like I always expect to pay sales tax, right? And like those handful of times, because I don't know every taxable fact throughout the
Mhm.
the US. Sometimes we do have to research it, right? But one of the big ones you see is like food in certain states. There's different foods that are taxed at different rates and whatnot. So like as a consumer, I always expect to pay sales tax. So I'm sure those conversations sometimes can be tough for customers when they're not expecting it or when they're not seeing it from previous months. But the business, is doing the right thing, right? Like the
Mhm.
business is evaluating their tax position, and every business should, especially in the e-commerce space as laws are changing. I mentioned food, and I know that's not really your space, but like, bird feed in some states can be taxable, and some states it might not be, right?
Right.
So, and that's something that, somebody who's using your product might need in order to get those birds to come to the feeder, right? So it's definitely changing too constantly, what is taxable and what is not taxable. One of the
Right.
things that Brianne and I get the privilege of doing here at with them is being able to, write articles and being able to inform our clients about the different changes that are going on. And I can tell you, and I'm sure Bria can attest to it too, every week it's something different. It's always
Right.
exciting to be in the sales tax world, and especially in the e-commerce world and retail space as well. Like these things are constantly changing, even though they feel like they've been around forever.
That's why I appreciate when I get an email notification of some state changing their sales tax as of January 1st. I'm usually emailing both of you immediately to say, does this apply to me? Because once again, I want to go to the experts and I don't want to have to guess and figure it out myself if I kind of go down the wrong path. So it's always helpful, and I appreciate the kind of quick turnaround where we can quickly chat to say, yes, this applies to you, or no, it doesn't.
Yeah. If you don't already, you should subscribe to our Dash of Salt. We release articles weekly that talk about this type of thing all the time. So
Mhm.
feel free to join and get those
Mhm.
emails. Everybody wants to talk about sales tax. Uh, so, you know, in your role currently with Bird Buddy, one of the things that I'm sure is complicated is, how do you balance compliance with your general like seamless customer experience, right? Do you have any tips of the trade of like how you've been dealing with those issues when you do have a customer that comes up and says, hey, well, you didn't charge me last month, but you're charging me now?
I think it's really kind of a case by case basis. And I don't think I've ever come across a customer that complained about not being charged sales tax. But really, it's just question of just having the process set up and be consistent with charging sales tax and making sure that our invoices are quite clear that, okay, you're paying X amount for the feeder, X amount for the seeds, X amount for shipping, and then sales tax is charged based on this. And we try to have our invoices be as clear as possible to the customer to
Mm-hmm.
kind of alleviate any concerns and kind of head off any questions.
Yeah, and I think that's a great tip. Like separately stating and making sure that your invoices are clear. We've talked a lot about how there's varying differences throughout the states, and that's a key part in making sure that you're charging sales tax properly is making sure that it's itemized essentially, right?
Right.
So love hearing that. Do you have any experiences with exemptions or customers that are exempt?
Yes. We do have a growing B2B business where we're selling to some major retailers in the US and who are then selling the products on our behalf. So we do collect exemption forms from each of our B2B customers, and we're able to then note that in our software that while we're still having sales, they're non-taxable sales because, again, we have to report all of our sales regardless of whether they're taxed or not by collecting the exemption forms and making sure they're properly filled out and signed and dated and currently in effect, because we've learned that some have blanket exemptions that
Mhm.
last forever and some are just expire every year. So we want to make sure that we're collecting them and holding them in a timely basis and able to find them in case sales tax audit comes up and there's any issues there. We're able to have all that support ready and good to go. But yeah, basically just making sure that everything is documented correctly and everything's up to date.
Yeah, one of the things that we see is there's generally two ways that I see a lot of our clients and businesses kind of handle exemptions is really a manual side, right? Where that's where like you're collecting them, you're reviewing them, you're following up or keeping some sort of tracking schedule of when they expire, if they expire, are they blankets, who were they signed by, so on and so forth, right? And then there's also the other side of like automating it, right? It's, we talked a little bit about compliance and automating your compliance. And there are softwares, right, that are available that can do that. But it falls kind of in line with the same conversation that we were having earlier is somebody still has to keep track of, right? Somebody still has to know what's going on there
Right.
and be abreast of the different changes. We are seeing that, like you had mentioned, like the blanket exemptions to exist, right? And those kind of are in existence until your license is withdrawn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there are other states, though, that do have limits on them. They do only be valid for a year or so on and so forth. Like Florida, for example, where you have to print one out every year and it expires every year. So,
Right.
there's a lot when it comes to the exemption space and how to handle it. But it's kind of in your position as you're growing at this B2B, it's one of those things that just kind of is added on the business to be able to manage and to take care of and to retain, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
throughout the years, it probably will become a little bit easier and harder for you as you start to expand this type of business for yourself.
Right.
Yeah, and also it's always exciting hearing companies have a good grasp of what to do next when you take that step with B2B businesses and your understanding of let's make sure we have those exemption certificates, right? Let's make sure we have it managed properly. Let's make sure all of our sales are flowing to our system to properly report our gross receipts, even though they're not taxable, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times under audit, right? An audit could be picked up because your gross receipts don't match your sales tax returns and your business tax returns. And that's a good way for an audit to be flagged, as well as under audit not having those exemption certificates collected could be a big headache for the business. So seeing companies on top of that is always exciting in our space.
Right.
100%. And also, you know, well, have you had to deal with providing exception certificates for BirdBuddy or any of the other businesses that you've worked with?
Providing, no. I've
Okay,
never
because I was gonna say
worked
that's the
for
other
a
fun side.
resale business, so it's
Yeah,
luckily, yeah.
yeah. No, I mean that's the other fun side of it, right? Is certain states only allow you to provide an exemption certificate if you're registered. I brought up Florida as a perfect example. Like you can't get that exemption certificate unless you're physically registered for a sales and use tax in the state for at least
Hmm.
for resale, right? So, that's something, that companies have to deal with as well as when you have certain items that you're purchasing that maybe you're incorporating into that final product, right? And you want to provide a resale certificate, you might actually need to be registered in order to even provide that exemption certificate. So it becomes almost like an animal of its own. Like Priya mentioned, it's always great to hear when we are working with our clients or our businesses that are, abreast that or understanding of the exemption process, right? But it's also ever changing on that front too. Like it's not just your sales tax rates that change, it's also all your exemptions that are going to change too throughout the years. And the forms change too. There are expired forms. Sometimes we get some audits where the auditors are like, yeah, can they get an updated form? So it's always a fun experience. One of the things that I always like to hear is do you have any like tips and advice for other businesses that are out there that are, just starting the process in the e-commerce space of implementing a sales and use tax automation or automatic solution, I guess is what we would say, automatic solution, right? Is that
I think it goes back to what I said earlier, and just knowing kind of what you're good at and what you're an expert in, and knowing what you're not an expert in, and hopefully some experts like the team out with them that helps me and out with various excuse me, various areas that I'm not super familiar with and don't have a complete grasp of, or don't really even have the bandwidth to get too involved with, and knowing when to ask questions and get the experts involved and get them in part of the process, and kind of see what their recommendations are, whether you should be signing up for various third-party software to handle the automation, or if the business is still small enough, maybe you can just do it manually for first year that the business is in, but really to kind of weigh your options as soon as possible and get a good understanding of kind of which way you should go. And if you need to have a little more pain by setting up that third party software now for not a ton of sales to kind of justify it, but you have a lot of hope and faith in growing the business X, 5X, 10X. You want to just set things up now and then not have to worry about 6 months, 1 year down the road.
Yeah, no, could not echo that sentiment more than what you just said. I'm like a big advocate for one, surrounding yourself with people who know what they're doing, right? Or, I always say it's smarter than I am, right? Because you can always have, additional opinions to kind of help field what your decision is as a business, right? Because there's plenty of paths to take. There's never really one that's just the only path that you can take, right? But also, just understanding what the options are is major. I'm always about, getting a couple quotes of maybe different softwares because they all kind of function a little bit different, right?
Hmm.
And in terms of not just their pricing, but also what is available, and how they function. So, understanding the different options that are available, and you nailed it right on the head. It's almost like you took it from one of our meetings where I always say, like, the sales tax price up front, it's hefty, right? Like putting in something and putting in an automation system, and kind of getting everything, all your ducks lined up, definitely is costly for a business, unfortunately. But the long-term effect of having everything set up in the beginning just saves you so much money down the road,
Right.
right? Especially because, God forbid, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, not collecting, over collecting, like having to deal with all of that process, not collecting exemption certificates, getting audited, and having to go back to your customers that no longer exist, right? Like,
Hmm.
so all of that can be so complicated and costly ultimately for a business down the road. And if you put in the time, the effort in the beginning to kind of get those things in place, it really just makes it so much less painful as you go throughout the process of growing the business, right? Go ahead, Bria.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. One of the biggest things as businesses, or your goal is to grow. Your goal is to exceed your prior year. And ultimately, when you continue to grow, if you aren't handling your sales tax implications, then that continues to grow. Your potential exposure continues to grow because sales tax, not to get too technical, but sales tax is a trust tax, and it's a tax that ultimately is on the founders and the officers of the company if there were any mistakes made or if there was anything not collected that should have been collected. So getting on top of everything at the beginning and any sales tax implications on the business at the beginning is gonna stop those headaches down the line when your intentions are to continue to grow and flourish as a business. And even under due diligence, if you ever go to sell your business, or that's the approach that a business wants to take in the future, right? Sales tax holds up some of those due diligence deals, so it's super important just at the at the forefront, getting it handled and understanding that those costs are going to tenfold down the line if it is not handled accordingly.
Exactly. Yeah, I've dealt with that during due diligence of potential exposure in US and especially abroad where that is a whole other animal than that, especially being here based here in the US and working for American companies that some have international operations, some do not, and trying to handle all of that yourself is just a impossible task. It's where again, you really have to rely on the experts and get their advice and kind of come up with a game plan altogether to move forward.
Yeah, we didn't even touch base on due diligence. It's like a meeting in and of itself, or a whole nother podcast, right? But yeah, you're 100% correct. Under due diligence, this is one of the biggest things that we see come up, right? It's not handling sales and use tax, and then trying to handle sales and use tax when you're under due diligence. It's so crammed and it's rushed and it's you don't get a second to breathe when you're trying to handle it under that circumstances. So 100%. I think one of the last questions that I kind of have for you truly is, we talked about a lot of, the advice that you offered, which is really, getting other people in the mix to help progress and make sure that things are put into place correctly. But is there any other advice that you might have for a business that's trying to just navigate in this space of sales and use tax and the changes that you've seen?
I think the biggest thing would be to realize that you're not alone and other companies are facing the same issues you are, and not everyone is going to be 100% compliant across the country. And there's always some issue that maybe some product wasn't being taxed at the correct rate, or maybe you aren't actually turned on collections for a time period and something didn't get remitted correctly. So I think to kind of look at the overall big picture and again realize that all the states should want to work with you and resolve any kind of issues, and understand that companies aren't in the sales tax business. We're not here to just pay sales tax. We're here to sell a product that we're passionate about and make our customers happy and everything that goes along with that. And while sales tax is an important part of the business, it shouldn't drive the business.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, you definitely can't make all your business decisions based on sales tax, right?
Right.
There's many other factors that are involved when it comes to growing and developing a business.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us on today's Witham eSuites interview episode. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and getting a better understanding from your side of sales and use tax in the e-commerce space.
Thank you.